in pursuit of health and wisdom. Sapio with Buck Joffrey.
Welcome back to Sapio with Buck Joffrey. And today my guest on Sapio is Daniel Bowling. He is in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University School of Medicine. And he's also with the Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics at Stanford as well. Daniel, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks so much, Buck. It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So this is an interesting topic, again, which I admitted to you, at the beginning offline that I know very little about. And I'm curious about it. We ran into your paper on Nature and, wanted to dig into this a little bit deeper. How did you yourself get interested in the idea of using music for health and, psychology?
Yeah, great question. It's been a bit of a journey. So I grew up playing music, started studying music from a neuroscience perspective in graduate school, but was always kind of on the basic science side. I spent time studying, interested in basic questions like why is music so impactful on our emotions? I studied that from the perspective of evolutionary biology, animal vocalization, bioacoustics, which is like biological sound production. It really wasn't until I did this work abroad. I was in Vienna in Austria for about 6 years, and it wasn't until I came back to the United States and back to Stanford in particular, where I was in a psychiatry department, that I started thinking about the overlap between music and mental health. And, what I came to realize was that, all these core effects of music that we know and understand from not only kind of a everyday perspective, but like a scientific perspective, that music affects our emotions, that affects our moods, that it affects the reward system, that affects social behavior, that these are all core dimensions of mental health.
Sure.
And so the overlap is like almost perfect. So it just became something that I kind of had to do. I couldn't not think about it in this way once I saw this overlap. And I've been doing that for the last 5 years now. And the paper that you mentioned is kind of an effort to bring these fields together, which aren't obviously going to be related for a lot of people.
Yeah. And I like this because it creates a little bit more science behind this. I mean, certainly I remember even as a physician and or in medical school in particular, there was opportunities for music in hospital rooms for sick patients and things like that. But I always just kind of thought of it as a nice gesture, not necessarily something with healing capacity. But let's start out with this, if you wouldn't mind. Let's start out with some definitions. Let's start out with the word musicality, and I guess the question is, what is musicality, and how is it different from music?
Right. Yeah. So it's really about the whole kind of project of thinking about music in like a serious scientific mental health perspective is to study it from a biological perspective. And that's really different than how we all interface with music as a kind of cultural artifact. So the first thing is to say, I'm not going to study music as a cultural phenomenon of infinite variety. Everybody does something different. Everybody likes something different. Now I'm going to focus on the core properties of music and things like rhythm and tonality. And not only that, but what is it about humans that makes these things so special to us? Sure. Because, no matter how many times you play your favorite song on the radio at home, your dog or your cat's not going to start dancing around, So there's something about humans as a species that is especially aligned with music. And musicality is really kind of the suite of abilities and traits that we have that allow us to appreciate music.
You mentioned
it, to hear it.
Right. You mentioned tonality. What exactly is tonality?
Yeah. So tonality, if you're around a bunch of musicologists can get very technical in its definitions, but I just define it simply as the use of tones to make music. Tones are just sounds that have pitch. Mm-hmm. So this is already like a universal. If you go anywhere in the world and you listen to their music, this is the type of sound we use to make music. Mm-hmm. We don't, rub. Musics are not based on rubbing two sticks together in a lot of different shapes of sticks. I mean, you could make something like that. Yeah. But music is almost invariably uses these pitched sounds, these tones.
Yeah. That's fascinating. So there's something wired in us. There's something sort of hardwired in us to hear certain pitches as something that we recognize as sort of a pleasurable music as opposed to random other noises. So I mean, it's interesting just to think of it that way because why is that, right?
Yeah, music's not a free for all.
Right.
It's highly structured.
Okay, so rhythm, people have probably some ideas of what comes to mind when you think about rhythm, but from the standpoint of what you're studying, how would you define rhythm as a scientist?
Yeah, rhythm, again, in very broad terms, is about the temporal organization of sound in music. And it's characterized by things like regularity. So there's some sort of repeating pattern. And it's predictable. That's kind of the big thing about rhythm is that it allows you to kind of synchronize yourself with music. It allows your brain literally to grab on to what's happening and predict it and fulfill its predictions and to anticipate. And that turns out to be a really, really important thing for music's mental health applications.
Yeah. So when you think about, this is a big question, but how does music affect the brain? And what are some of the biological mechanisms that are involved with those effects?
Yeah. So, it's very deep. It affects the brain in many, many different ways. I like to kind of think about it in terms of the effects of tones and the effects of rhythm. I should just say that, the reason I believe that the tones are so effective for us is that, think about what we're doing right now. We're using our voices. Our voices are full of tones.
Yes.
These are when our vocal folds vibrate, they create tones. And our brains are highly, highly tuned to extracting information from these tones. Not only language, but like feeling, how the person I'm talking to, how do they feel about me? How are they receiving the information? These things are incredibly important to what you take away from an interaction. So the nervous system and the auditory nervous system has evolved to be incredibly efficient at this. And so this is why when we take those tones out of music, out of speech, and we distill them and we pitch them in certain ways and we extend them, we draw them out, they have an incredible impact on your emotional physiology.
Mm-hmm. Are there certain parts of the brain that receive and react to music more than others?
Yeah. So probably the most significant point of progress in the neuroscience of music over the last several decades has been the realization that music engages your brain's reward system.
Mm-hmm.
So which is
the dopamine system and all that, right?
Yeah, dopamine, endogenous opioids, and this is really at the core of a lot of motivated behavior, right?
Sure.
So the system is what responds to food and sex and drugs of abuse, and so this system is stimulated by music. If you've ever had the experience of getting chills from music, that's like dopamine surges in the nucleus accumbens in the core of your reward system. So, you can stimulate your reward system in lots of ways, right?
Yeah.
But music is incredibly good at doing this. And it's a really interesting thing.
It's fascinating to me because I think about, as you're talking about that, I've studied marketing a fair amount. And the interesting thing is that a lot of these elements that you're talking about, there's a parallel just in language, right? And, what you say, when you say it, intonations, making references to put a person in a certain mindset. So it's interesting because to me, it sort of seems like what you're doing is potentially having a music, sell your brain a different mood.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a huge part of speech, right? The music of speech.
Yeah.
Like the way that we speak. I think about like political rhetoric, right?
Yeah.
Or like a comedian, like the timing, right? Like those things are so important to impact. And any public speaker or a musician knows these things and knows how to manipulate these things to sell your brain on a different mood or
yeah. And success, like I think for people who are even in podcasting spaces, for example, I've had some people tell me, oddly enough, that they listen to me at night because I help them to go to sleep, but it's not because they're bored per se, but there's something about my voice and the way I talk that helps them relax, which I find kind of interesting. But again, that's one of those things that I think I'm guessing that's kind of sort of where your research is in trying to figure out how those messages, those audible messages are received and turned into something else. Let's talk about mental health, because I think that mostly what you're talking about is the benefits on mental health. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that there are benefits for what one might call physical health, but they're pretty hard, mental health and physical health, pretty hard to distinguish.
Yeah. That's a good point. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about, the mental health treatment, how there are specific mental conditions that might respond to music-based type interventions.
Right. Yeah. So, another major contributor to like my research and my kind of scholarship is music therapy. Music therapy is 70 years old. It originated in the context of treating veterans after the world wars, shell shock and kind of in psych wards, trying to modulate affect. Music therapy has been used. There are large scale meta-analyses that have come out over the last 5 to 10 years showing efficacy against a variety of different, psychopathologies like depression, disorders of mood, anxiety, autism, dementia.
So give us some, if you would, you could dive a little bit deeper on, some of the research that's out there on music and say depression, because obviously depression is something that a lot of people suffer from. What do we know? What does the data and the research say about music specifically as a therapy for depression? Yeah,
so there have been dozens and dozens of studies looking at mental health variables, or looking at depression specifically, and with various courses of music therapy, whether this is like a kind of what's called interactive music therapy, where you're interacting with a musical therapist, maybe you're making some music, or you are just receiving music, you're listening to music that's been prescribed to you, you're doing it every day for a certain amount of time or once a week, kind of a standard psychotherapy or behavioral intervention compared against a control condition. And they show strong effect sizes. Especially when you think about the efficacy of these treatments relative to first line treatments, right? So we struggle to treat depression.
Sure.
And so there's an interest in alternatives, and there are many different forms of music therapy and music therapies that have been used against depression. Part of the problem is standardization, and a lot of this is one-on-one, it's the individual therapist and their intuition and their experience and how they do the therapy. And so my research is really aimed at trying to use the kind of the biology of music and understanding how it affects, for example, the reward system to systematically design treatment that is going to stimulate your reward system. For example, if you're anhedonic or you struggle with taking pleasure in things.
That's an interesting concept. I'd like to know more about that, especially when you talk about anhedonia. So anhedonia is essentially, from a psychiatric, just for everybody, the definition is essentially what you can think about is enjoyment in nothing, right? That's a certain kind of depression where it's not necessarily, actively sad, but just simply an inability to experience joy. And
right.
So tell us specifically a little bit about the research, like the kinds of music, what have you done and what have you seen?
Preferred music, if somebody's individual music preferences, this is what's best at stimulating your reward system. However, music can make you feel a lot of different ways emotionally. And you might not be choosing music that is going to lift your mood.
Right.
You might, for example, someone who's depressed might choose to listen to music that's going to sustain or increase their sadness, right? And
right.
so, and they might take some enjoyment from that, but it might not be therapeutic, right? So a lot of this is in kind of how do you design music, or how do you curate music to take somebody's kind of preferences and what they like and create a listening program around that is designed to not be a downer, essentially.
Right. So it's almost like a pharmaceutical manipulation, right? I mean, if you think about like designing a pill that triggers a certain reaction in your brain, you're trying to effectively engineer music that will do the same. So how do you do that?
Yeah. So there are a number of key principles that you can take from music therapy. If you look across all these different types of music therapy, say, okay, what are the ways to do this? So one of the ways is something called ISO principle. It's one of these core practices in music therapy. And what you do is you create music that is structured acoustically to match a listener's current mood state. So if somebody's feeling depressed and they want to feel happier, you're going to create music that sounds depressed, right? It's going to be sticky and slow and low energy, and that's going to kind of match their mood state. And then after you've kind of established that kind of shared affect and shared feeling, you can gradually introduce musical changes that are going to pick up the energy level, elevate the mood. And the way that you do this is through the way that I think about it is through bioacoustic principles. What happens to your voice when you become excited, when you become enthusiastic? What are the acoustic changes there that communicate emotional positivity, and how do you mirror those in music? This is kind of a scientific approach to like an artistic problem. If you can go and talk to a musician, a talented musician will be like, oh, well, I might not tell you exactly how I'm going to do it, but here's what I'm going to do.
Right.
I'm going to pick up the tempo. I'm going to raise the pitch. I'm going to sharpen the tone attacks. I'm going to increase the range of the pitches that I use. So a nice thing is the confluence between the science and the art, that the methodologies are kind of the same.
I'm curious, when you studied this, what are the endpoints? You also are you using EEG? Are you mapping, changes and what's being stimulated based on certain types of music? Yeah.
So there are, in psychiatry, which is very much about how people feel, the relevance of kind of behavioral measures remains central. Depression,
sure.
Instruments that measure depressive symptoms, but also, physiology, things like cortisol, right? Like stress levels, things like I do a lot of psychophysiology. So things like trying to measure the activity of your autonomic nervous system and how arousal is being modulated. You can look at micro expressions on the face to look at kind of the valence, the positivity or negativity of an emotional reaction. And that's kind of like laying the foundation for neuroimaging, right? Or for
Yeah.
EEG, where you're then looking, for example, in EEG at synchrony, like what is the degree to which a person's brain has been able to entrain to the rhythm of a piece of music as a good indicator of its impact on the nervous system.
If you go back to the, I guess the analogy of a pharmaceutical in, say in depression, it might be an SSRI, like Prozac or something like that. And effectively, we know the mechanism of that, right? And, we may not know exactly why it works, but we know what the medication does. And there's a reproducibility about that specific type of compound. Is there a parallel to that in music in the sense that certain types of music you can, should affect everybody kind of the same way? Or is it much more of a personalized type thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think to maximize efficacy, you kind of want a certain type of music, but then you want to personalize it, right? So you want to have, for example, something that's, if you were trying to elevate mood, you want to have something that's upbeat, that has a tempo that is maybe, from in the range of 80 to 120 beats per minute, that is going to be stimulating. And if you want to talk about the mechanisms, people have done studies where somebody takes a radio tracer, a radioactive tracer for dopamine binding, and then listens to music they find rewarding, and you can show the activation, show the binding of dopamine in the reward system. But I think the mechanisms, there's probably many different mechanisms, and those are the ones that we understand and have mapped out to the fullest extent. And that's kind of what some of the psychophysiology is aimed at too, is like getting, like when you experience musical reward, when you have chills in response to music, you can self-report those, but you can also record them from the skin or from the heart. So
I know there's people listening who are really into human performance and that kind of thing. Are there certain types of music that seem to, say, sharpen our intellect or, make us or increase our motivation? And what can you tell us about those types of music?
Yeah. There is a literature on the effects of music on cognition. This kind of all got a little bit out of hand. I don't know if you remember something called the Mozart effect.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, so
baby Mozart, right? Like all these parents hoping their kid would end up a genius would play Mozart.
Right. So it's a nature study basically showing that people after listening to music improve their performance on a spatial reasoning task. But this got picked up and turned into listening to Mozart makes you smart.
Yeah.
But certain types of tasks, particularly repetitive tasks that, maybe don't involve the maximum level of concentration where you're making new connections and generating new insights, but kind of attracts tasks that involve a level of repetition, a level of routine that can be kind of dull and might generate negative emotion otherwise. They can be facilitated by music. Particularly rhythmic music. I mean, these are work songs, right? This is work songs, and they can improve performance, right? Because if you have music that's going to pick up your arousal level and make you feel better, that's a pretty good foundation for improving your performance.
This whole thing, the idea of music, and actually, I was singing these the other day about people's inclination across the globe to listen to music and also to move to it and to dance to it and all that kind of thing. It seems to me that there's something, again, hardwired. And if it's hardwired, there's an evolutionary perspective on what's going on. Can you discuss maybe a little bit of what we know about or think about the evolutionary aspects of music and I guess musicality?
Yeah. This is a fascinating area for me. Yeah, so I think we have to think about what music is again. So music is made of tones, and it's made of rhythm. And if you go out in the environment and you try to find where these types of sounds exist,
Mm-hmm.
they exist in animal communication. They are forms of communication. You don't record tones if you go into the forest, like the wind blowing through the leaves, the trees, water rustling. These aren't tonal sounds. Tonal sounds are produced by regular vibration, and those are almost always biological. So the origins of music almost certainly lie in social communication, in the sounds we use to affect each other. And starting from there, you can look at the evolution of the voice and how it started is, the fish crawled out of the ocean and they got a valve for protecting their lungs, and it starts to make sound every time they're squishing and squirming around, and those sounds become effective and useful for some purpose. Now we have what we have today, which is the larynx, which is a complex of nerves and muscles and tendons and ligaments that's very finely tuned for voice production. So this system evolved, and music is kind of part and parcel of that. It's a music and speech, music and language are something that we do and we excel at.
Yeah.
And so this is where the origins lie of musical behavior, lies in social communication. Now,
and so the idea being that somehow certain types of music or musicality trigger or mimic situations which might inspire various emotions. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah. Or you directly communicate them, right?
Yeah.
Like a scream. A scream has certain acoustic characteristics that if you put those into music, like an electric guitar, an overdriven electric guitar that has a rough timbre, it communicates a certain level of aggression that you get in the voice if you overdrive your vocal folds with a lot of pressure from your lungs because you're in a really tense situation.
Right.
So there's a logic to how it works.
Let's kind of go back again to music as a therapy for a moment. And one thing I meant to ask you was, usually there's in the medical literature or science, you're often comparing things. And so with traditional therapy in mood disorders, you're going to have pharmacologics typically. Is there anything comparing, music therapy to pharmacologics or any other kind of interventions?
Yeah, there are a few studies. And, I would hesitate to say, music therapy is going to be better than pharmacologics, right? Because I think there's so much variation in how people respond, right?
Right.
And so, but the studies that have been done show that it's as effective or more effective in some cases. So, and you have to think also that, you don't have side effects, right? And you not making a chemical manipulation. Well, maybe you are making a chemical manipulation.
Yeah.
But I think it's still kind of like early days. They're difficult studies to do, right? I mean, to do them in a well-controlled fashion and to administer the music therapy in a consistent fashion. So we kind of need to develop better standardized treatments in order to really map out the space, and in order to also determine who's most likely to benefit, right? So
let's just so that people have an idea, like, okay, somebody is going to have, music therapy. What would something like that look like? I mean, in terms of, I guess, dosage and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, these are questions that the field is grappling with, but like, if you look at just basic interventions, you could have, for example, you could report with anxiety, right? You have some sort of anxiety disorder, or you're struggling with anxiety, and you are prescribed a playlist of relaxing music that you're going to listen to for 20 to 30 minutes a day for 3 weeks, something like this. And it's going to be contrasted against, treatment as usual or pharmacologic. But yeah, I think that's one type of approach. There might be another approach where you're meeting with a music therapist like you would meet with a psychotherapist, and they're going to use music to move your mood in the session. There are also approaches to music therapy that kind of combine it with psychotherapy, where you're using the music as kind of a touchstone to access your emotions and bring things out that you then discuss.
Have you looked into psychedelics with music at all? I'm just curious.
Yeah. So, you know, that's a fascinating area. I mean, you know, one of the leading psychedelic researchers at UCSF, I heard him recently say, like, yeah, it's funny, you know, you could think of psilocybin therapy as like, you know, psilocybin assisted music therapy, because the music plays such a big role in the journey.
Yeah.
So there's something very interesting going on there as well.
Sure.
But, you know, it's early days also for not only for the psychedelics, but for the interaction between psychedelics and music.
Sure. So I guess the last thing I want to ask you before we go is, you know, anybody who's listening to this is thinking, well, gosh, I might want to try something like this. Maybe it helps.
Yeah.
I mean, how would you even start? I mean, this is not something that's, you know, available everywhere.
Like one basic thing that I tell people is that, like, you know, first of all, take music seriously as a therapy, as a mental health therapy, especially if you're someone who likes music and who is lucky enough to have paid attention and has a collection of music that you like.
Right.
You know, access it. You know, think about the energy levels in it. Think about how it makes you feel. Think about how you can organize it to stimulate yourself. And, you know, realize that the kind of dominant mode of music listening in our culture is not organized therapeutically. It's organized for entertainment and for stimulation and to grab your attention. Well,
how do you find that kind of music? I mean, how do you know if you're listening to music that's therapeutic?
Yeah, so it's you know, I think on a level of personal preference.
Yeah.
If you like it and it's making you feel good, then that's a very good start.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I will say, like, I consult for some companies. Like, there are companies in the music and mental health space that have tried to create music explicitly in this way.
What are some of those well-known companies, just for people to check out potentially?
Yeah, so one of them is called Spiritune. That's one that I worked very closely with. Spiritune. Okay. Yeah, and that's one word. And they have a really cool approach to kind of this question of how do you find the music, because what they do is center how you feel and how you want to feel. So instead of going and being like, well, you know, I want to listen to this artist right now, or I want to listen to this genre right now, you go in and you say, I feel lethargic, I feel depressed, I feel anxious, I feel irritated. And then on the back end, we select the music that is going to match that state and then also take you to where you want to go.
And that's based on testing, I guess, of a lot of people who it seems to affect. How do you design that, I guess, you know?
Yeah, so it's based on again, these kind of the bioacoustic principles, the principles of emotion in the voice. Mm-hmm. And it's also based on music therapy. So, you know, ISO principle, like this idea that you're going to meet somebody where they're at and then transition them. And that's going to be more effective than just hitting you. You might feel depressed and you want to feel better. I'm going to hit you with dance music. Like might not be as useful.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think it's funny, like, yeah, there's a major disconnect between, like, even though we all use music to kind of modulate how we feel, you know, there's a disconnect when you want to go and listen to music between, you know, that process of selection. Again, this question that you ask, how do you find the right music? You know, I could say, oh, well, you know, study the literature and then, like, realize that, you know, but yeah, so there are companies that are trying to kind of like lower the energy barrier there and change the way that we select music. Bottom line, I think probably the most useful thing across the board is just, like, take it seriously. It's not just entertainment. It is a deeply rooted phenomenon in our biology that we can use to move mental health variables for ourselves.
Where can people learn more about this who maybe aren't scientists, but really just want to, I mean, maybe they're not going to read the article in Nature, but want to get some more information? Maybe about your research as well?
Yeah. I think there's kind of a popular interest now in music and health. Not like the NIH, for example, is funding studies in the intersection of music and health. And there's kind of a blogosphere presence. Like if you go and look, like if you just Google music and health, you can find all kinds of write-ups that have gotten increasingly better and more informed. Obviously, you can't, Googling, you won't necessarily find accurate things all the time, but the level is picking up, I'd say, just across the board. Yeah. So. That's what I would search. There are some popular books too, if you're interested in the way that music affects the brain. There's a book by a guy named Dan Levitin called "This Is Your Brain on Music." Oliver Sacks, Musicophilia. There's a researcher that's done a lot of work, Robert Sattore, on music and the reward system. His work and kind of popular write-ups on his work would be interesting to learn about if you're interested in anhedonia and reward and musical pleasure.
Yeah, fantastic. Daniel, thank you so much for being on Sapio today. It's been really interesting and fun to learn about something like this.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope you continue this important work.
Thanks so much. And hopefully we'll have you on again sometime.
Sounds good. Thanks, Buck.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Sapio with Buck Joffrey. A quick reminder that while I am, in fact, a surgeon, nothing I say should be construed as medical advice. Now, make sure to include your physician in any medical decisions you make. And also, if you're enjoying the show, please make sure to show your support with a like, share, or subscribe. Until next time, this is Buck Joffrey for Sapio with Buck Joffrey.